Some mysteries defy explanation. Some stories strain the very fabric of what we believe is possible. This is one of those stories. Eleanor Matthews was just 24 years old when she vanished without a trace from her home in the small town of Oak Ridge, Connecticut, on a crisp autumn morning in 1937. A devoted mother to her 4-year-old daughter Margaret and wife to her husband James, Eleanor was described by everyone who knew her as kind, reliable, and utterly devoted to her family. She had grown up in Oak Ridge herself, the daughter of the local pharmacist, and had married her high school sweetheart just 5 years earlier. Their modest 2-story colonial home on Maple Street was always immaculate, with curtains Eleanor had sewn herself and a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no goodbye note. Nothing missing from the home except Eleanor herself and the clothes she was wearing that day. A navy blue dress with white polka dots, a light cardigan, and her favorite pair of brown Oxford shoes. The breakfast dishes were washed and put away. Her daughter's lunch was prepared and wrapped neatly on the kitchen counter. The radio was still playing softly in the living room, tuned to a program of morning orchestral music. Eleanor's purse was gone, but her wedding ring and other jewelry remained in the small wooden box on her dresser. Even her coat still hung by the door, despite the autumn chill. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and into thin air. The search for Eleanor Matthews would become one of the most extensive in Oak Ridge history. Police combed the woods surrounding the family home, dragging the small lake at the edge of town. Neighbors formed search parties that spread out across the county. Her photograph was circulated throughout the state, appearing in newspapers as far away as Boston and New York. The local newspaper ran daily updates on the case for weeks. The headline that first day read, "Local Mother Vanishes. Foul Play Suspected." James Matthews offered a substantial reward, nearly all their savings, for information leading to her whereabouts. Sheriff Thomas Landry, who had known the Matthews family for years, personally led the investigation. He interviewed dozens of people, neighbors who might have seen something, the milkman who had delivered to their home that morning, shopkeepers Eleanor frequented, even the town's drifters and troublemakers. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had noticed Eleanor leaving her home that day. No one reported seeing her walking through town or boarding a bus. It was as if she had disappeared between one moment and the next. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the trail grew cold. The daily newspaper updates dwindled to weekly mentions, then occasional references. Eventually, the search was called off. Eleanor Matthews became a ghost, a whispered tragedy, a cautionary tale told by parents to remind their children to be careful. Rumors circulated, as they always do in small towns. Some said she had run off with another man. Others whispered about mental instability, about the pressures of motherhood. A few even suggested that James himself might have been involved, though no evidence ever pointed in that direction. For her husband James and daughter Margaret, life had to go on, even as the mystery remained unsolved. The void Eleanor left behind would never be filled, and the questions about her fate would haunt them for decades to come. James would jump every time the telephone rang, rush to the door at unexpected knocks. Little Margaret would ask daily when her mother was coming home, unable to comprehend the permanence of the loss. Christmas came and went that year with presents Eleanor had already purchased and hidden away in the attic, wrapped by James's trembling hands. Margaret's 5th birthday was celebrated quietly, the child blowing out candles with the solemn wish that her mother would return. Fast forward to the present day. Margaret Matthews Wilson is now 87 years old, a grandmother of 5 with a lifetime of memories behind her. Her once auburn hair, so like her mother's, has long since turned silver. The slight resemblance to Eleanor that James had always commented on has been softened by time, but it's still there in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. Though she was only 4 when her mother disappeared, the absence has shaped her entire existence, a negative space around which her life has been built, like a river flowing around an immovable stone. She lives in a comfortable apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, filled with books and photographs and mementos from a well-lived life. But among all the pictures of her children, her grandchildren, her travels, there is one photograph that holds a special place, a faded portrait of a young woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile, taken in 1936. Eleanor Matthews, forever frozen at 23. "My earliest memories are of the days after she vanished," Margaret explains in a soft, measured voice. Her hands, spotted with age but still elegant, rest on her lap as she speaks. I remember my father's face, how it seemed to age overnight. I remember the strangers in uniform coming and going from our house. I remember the whispers, the way the other mothers would look at me with pity during Sunday school. But most of all, I remember waiting by the window each evening, certain that my mother would appear, walking up the path to our front door. I would sit there until my father carried me to bed, explaining again and again that sometimes people go away and we don't know when they'll come back. But she never did. James Matthews never remarried. The thought never even crossed his mind. How could he, when Eleanor might walk through the door at any moment? He raised Margaret alone, working as a clockmaker in the town shop. His skilled hands, which had once repaired the delicate mechanisms of watches and clocks, now prepared meals, braided Margaret's hair, and mended her clothes. Every night, he would leave a lamp burning in the window, just in case Eleanor found her way home. He never spoke of her in the past tense, never entertained theories that she might have met with foul play. In his mind, she was always just away, temporarily, and would return to them someday. My father was a man of extraordinary faith, Margaret says. Not just religious faith, though he had that too, but faith in my mother. He never believed she had abandoned us willingly. He never believed she was dead. He believed with absolute certainty that there was an explanation, and that someday she would come home. James kept Eleanor's side of the closet untouched. Her dresses hung there, year after year, even as fashions changed and the fabrics yellowed slightly with age. Her books remained on the shelves where she had left them. Her recipe box stayed in its place in the kitchen, and James would sometimes cook her recipes, telling Margaret stories about her mother's famous apple pie, or her secret ingredient in beef stew. He told me everything he could remember about her, Margaret recalls. How they met when they were 15, at the town's Founders' Day dance. How she could name every constellation in the night sky. How she sang while she did the washing. How she smelled like lavender and vanilla. He was determined that I would know her, even in her absence. James passed away in 1978, never knowing what happened to his beloved wife. He was 68 years old when a heart attack took him in his sleep. Margaret, by then a married woman with children of her own, found him the next morning when she came to check on him. The lamp in the window was still burning. I think he was waiting for her right up until his last breath, Margaret says. I found a letter in his bedside table after he died. It was addressed to my mother, dated the day before. He'd been writing to her all those years. Letters he never sent because he had nowhere to send them. That last one said he was feeling tired lately, that he hoped she would come home soon, because he missed her more with each passing day. Margaret grew up in the shadow of her mother's absence. She became a teacher, married a kind man named Robert Wilson, and had 3 children of her own. She made a good life for herself, determined not to let the mystery define her completely. But there was always a part of her that remained the 4-year-old girl at the window, waiting for her mother to come home. Her husband Robert understood this about her. He never objected to the weekends they would spend in Oak Ridge, visiting her father and walking the streets her mother had walked. He supported her when, every few years, she would renew the search, hiring another detective or following up on another potential lead. He held her on the anniversaries of her mother's disappearance, when the weight of not knowing would become almost unbearable. Over the years, Margaret had worked with various investigators, both official and amateur, trying to uncover what happened that autumn day in 1937. When she was in college, she used her small inheritance from her maternal grandmother to hire a private detective who spent 6 months retracing the original investigation, interviewing anyone still alive who might have seen something. In the 1960s, she contacted the FBI, hoping that new forensic techniques might shed light on the case. In the 1980s, when she was a grandmother herself, she appeared on a television show about unsolved disappearances, hoping that national exposure might bring new information. Every lead eventually dried up. Every potential sighting proved to be a case of mistaken identity. Every promising theory eventually collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence or lack of proof. The case of Eleanor Matthews remained unsolved, one of thousands of such mysteries that occupy small spaces in police archives across the country. I've tried everything, Margaret says, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. Private investigators, missing persons databases when they became available, DNA registries. I've tracked down distant relatives and old neighbors. I've read through police reports so many times I've memorized them. I've consulted psychics, though I don't really believe in such things. I've done everything I could think of to find out what happened to her. She pauses, looking down at her hands. My children think I should let it go. They worry about me, about what this lifelong search has done to me. And maybe they're right. I'm 87 years old. Whatever happened to my mother, she's almost certainly gone now. But how do you let go of a question that has defined your entire life? When you lose someone without explanation, there's never closure. The human mind isn't designed to process that kind of loss. We need answers. We need reasons. And when we don't have them, we create our own. Over the years, I've imagined 100 different scenarios. That she had amnesia and built a new life somewhere, not knowing she had a family waiting for her. That she witnessed something she shouldn't have and was taken away to protect her. That she had a secret life none of us knew about. In my darkest moments, I've imagined that she simply decided we weren't enough for her. That she walked away from us deliberately. Margaret's oldest granddaughter, Olivia, has never known a time when the mystery of her great-grandmother wasn't part of the family narrative. Now 32 and working as a curator at a small art gallery in Manhattan, she has her own fascination with the case. As a child, she would pore over the family albums with Margaret, asking questions about the beautiful woman in the old photographs. As a teenager, she wrote a school paper about famous, unsolved disappearances, featuring Eleanor's case prominently. In college, she studied criminal justice before switching to art history, partly inspired by her family's mystery. 3 months ago, Olivia invited Margaret to attend the opening of a photography exhibition at her gallery in New York City. The exhibition, entitled Urban Anonymity, featured candid photographs of crowds in various public spaces around the world, taken by a renowned street photographer named Julian West. The images captured the paradoxical loneliness of being surrounded by strangers, the way people can be physically close but emotionally distant in urban environments. Margaret wasn't particularly interested in modern photography, but she cherished any opportunity to spend time with her granddaughter. So, on a rainy Saturday in spring, she found herself wandering through the brightly lit gallery, sipping champagne from a plastic flute, nodding politely as Olivia enthusiastically explained the artistic merits of each photograph. The images were striking. Masses of humanity caught in transit, faces blank or preoccupied, occasionally startled by the camera's intrusion. Julian has this amazing ability to make you look at everyday scenes with new eyes, Olivia was saying, guiding her grandmother through the exhibition. Look at this one from Tokyo, the way the businessman seems isolated despite being surrounded by people. Or this one from London, how everyone is looking at their phones except for that one child staring directly at the camera. Margaret nodded, making appropriate sounds of appreciation. They moved through the gallery slowly, Margaret occasionally resting on benches placed strategically throughout the space. They were approaching the final section of the exhibition, featuring photographs taken in New York City, when Olivia was called away to deal with a question from another patron. "I'll be right back, Grandma," she said. "These last few are some of my favorites. They were all taken at Grand Central Terminal over the course of a single day." Margaret moved forward alone, studying the large black and white photographs that captured the bustling energy of New York's famous train station. Commuters rushing in all directions, tourists gazing up at the celestial ceiling, a couple embracing beside the information booth, a homeless man sleeping on a bench, ignored by the crowds flowing around him. And then she saw her, in a large photograph taken just 6 months ago. Among the rushing commuters and tourists stood a woman who was unmistakably, impossibly, Eleanor Matthews. She was slightly off-center in the frame, standing still while others blurred around her, as if she was the only point of clarity in a chaotic world. She was looking slightly upward, perhaps at the famous clock or the constellations painted on the ceiling. The champagne glass slipped from my hand, Margaret recalls, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't hear it shatter on the floor. All I could see was my mother's face, exactly as I remembered it from the photographs. Exactly as she looked in 1937. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I felt as if I was having some kind of stroke or hallucination. The woman in the photograph was wearing modern clothing, a black coat over a gray dress, with a red scarf tied at her neck in a style popular today. But her face, her posture, even the way she wore her hair, it was Eleanor, down to the small birthmark near her left eyebrow that Margaret had memorized from photographs. And most impossibly of all, she appeared not to have aged a day since 1937. The face that looked out from the photograph couldn't have belonged to a woman older than 25. People around me were asking if I was all right. Olivia was helping me to a bench, but all I could say was, "That's her. That's my mother." Olivia thought I was confused, that I was having some kind of episode. But I wasn't confused. I was seeing the impossible. Julian West, the photographer, was present at the gallery opening. Olivia, concerned about her grandmother's state, brought him over to speak with Margaret. He was a tall, bearded man in his 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. When Margaret pointed out the woman in his photograph, explaining with shaking hands who she believed it to be, he didn't dismiss her as delusional, as many might have. The photographer had no recollection of the specific woman in the crowd. The photograph had been taken during rush hour, one of hundreds he'd shot that day as part of his project documenting the human traffic patterns in Grand Central. He had been focused on composition, on light and shadow, not on the individual faces that appeared in his viewfinder. He had no way of identifying any of the individuals captured in his images, but he was moved by Margaret's story. He provided her with a high-resolution copy of the photograph and gave her permission to use it however she needed in her search. He even offered to look through the other photographs he had taken that day to see if the woman appeared in any of them. I knew how crazy it sounded, Margaret says. A woman who disappeared in 1937 showing up unchanged in a photograph from last year. It was impossible, but I've spent my whole life studying my mother's face in photographs. I would recognize her anywhere, under any circumstances, and this wasn't just a resemblance or a look-alike, it was her. I've spent my entire adult life investigating my mother's disappearance, Margaret says. I know every theory, every possibility that has ever been proposed, but nothing could have prepared me for this. When she returned to her apartment that evening, Margaret sat at her computer. The high-resolution image opened before her and began to make comparisons with the photographs of Eleanor she had digitized years earlier. She looked at every detail, the shape of the eyes, the angle of the jaw, the tiny scar on the woman's chin from a childhood fall. Everything matched. She used online tools to overlay the images, to measure facial proportions. The results were undeniable. The woman in Grand Central Terminal was identical to Eleanor Matthews. Margaret's children, when she told them about the photograph, were concerned. They spoke to each other in hushed phone calls about cognitive decline, about their mother's lifelong obsession finally tipping over into delusion. Her eldest son, Thomas, a psychiatrist, gently suggested that grief can sometimes manifest in unusual ways, especially in old age. Her daughter, Catherine, worried that Margaret was being taken advantage of by the photographer or the gallery. Only her youngest son, Michael, was willing to entertain the possibility that there might be something to his mother's claim. Mom has never been fanciful or prone to exaggeration, he told his siblings. If she says it's our grandmother in that photo, I think we should at least look into it before dismissing it. Margaret hired a private investigator, Daniel Cooper, who specialized in cold cases. Unlike the skeptical family members, Cooper approached the case with professional objectivity. He had seen enough strange things in his 25 years as an investigator to know that reality is often more bizarre than fiction. She showed him the photograph from the gallery, along with the family pictures from 1937. Cooper, a methodical man in his early 50s with a background in both law enforcement and computer science, analyzed the images carefully. I've been doing this job for 25 years, Cooper states, sitting in his modest office surrounded by filing cabinets and computer equipment, and I've never seen anything like this. The resemblance is beyond coincidence. Facial recognition software gives it a 97% match probability, which is essentially unheard of for unrelated individuals. Even identical twins don't match this closely, especially when the photos are taken decades apart. If I didn't know better, I'd say these photos were taken of the same woman on the same day. Cooper began by trying to identify the woman in the Grand Central photograph. He spoke with station security, reviewing their surveillance footage from the day the photograph was taken. He examined other photographs taken by Julian West, looking for additional images of the woman. He put out discreet inquiries through his network of contacts, showing the photograph to ticket sellers, regular commuters, and station employees. When you're looking for someone in New York City, it's like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a beach, Cooper explains. Unless they have a fixed address or routine, unless they show up in official records somewhere, they can be practically invisible, especially if they don't want to be found. For weeks, there was nothing. The woman seemed to have appeared in that single frame and then vanished again, just as Eleanor had done 80 years earlier. Cooper expanded his search, checking hotel registrations, rental agreements, credit card transactions. He searched social media platforms, facial recognition databases, driver's license records. Nothing matched. And then, a breakthrough. A ticket collector at Grand Central remembered the woman. She had purchased a one-way ticket to a small town in upstate New York called Milfield. The collector remembered her because she had paid in cash, which was unusual for a ticket costing nearly $60, and because she had seemed confused by the electronic ticketing system, as if she rarely took the train. He recalled helping her understand how to use the ticket, explaining that she didn't need to get it punched by a conductor like in the old days. She seemed nice, the ticket collector told Cooper. Polite, you know. Not like some of these people who act like you're invisible. Called me sir and thanked me for helping her. Had a kind of old-fashioned way of talking, if you know what I mean. Like my grandmother used to talk. Cooper drove to Milfield the next day. It was a picturesque town of about 3,000 people, the kind of place where newcomers were noticed. Once a thriving mill town, as its name suggested, it had reinvented itself as a quaint tourist destination, with antique shops and bed and breakfasts lining its main street. At the local diner, he showed the photograph to the waitress, a woman in her 50s named Dorothy who had worked there for over 20 years. "Oh, that's Elizabeth," Dorothy said immediately, without a moment's hesitation. "Elizabeth Crane. She moved here about 7 months ago. Keeps to herself, mostly. Lives in the old Whitaker house on Elm Street. Pretty woman, isn't she? Always dresses so nicely, not like folks around here who live in jeans and sweatshirts." Cooper asked more questions, building a picture of Elizabeth Crane's life in Milfield. She lived alone in a Victorian house she had purchased with cash. She had no apparent job but seemed financially comfortable. She volunteered at the local library twice a week, helping with their archives. She attended church on Sundays at the Episcopal Church on Main Street. She was unfailingly polite, but maintained a certain distance from her neighbors. She had mentioned once that she was a widow, but spoke little about her past. "There's something different about her," Dorothy confided. "Can't put my finger on it. It's like she's from another time, you know? The way she talks, the way she does things. My grandmother had a phrase for people like that. She'd say they had old souls. That's Elizabeth, an old soul." Cooper called Margaret immediately from the diner payphone, not wanting to use his cell phone in case someone overheard. "I found her," he said, his voice tense with excitement. "Or at least, I found the woman from the photograph. She's living under the name Elizabeth Crane. I need to see her," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt to remain calm. The next day, Margaret and Cooper drove to Milfield. The journey was mostly silent. What do you say when you're potentially about to meet your mother who disappeared 80 years ago but hasn't aged a day? What questions do you prepare? What emotions do you brace yourself for? Margaret stared out the window as the urban landscape gave way to suburbs and then to countryside, her mind racing with possibilities, each more implausible than the last. "What if it's not her?" she said suddenly, breaking the long silence. "What if it's just someone who looks remarkably like her? Then we apologize for the intrusion and leave," Cooper replied simply. "But what if it is her?" Margaret had no answer to that. They arrived in Milfield shortly after noon. Cooper drove slowly down Elm Street until they saw it. A beautiful Victorian home set back from the road, painted a soft blue with white trim and a wraparound porch. A neat garden bordered the stone path leading to the front steps. Window boxes overflowed with red geraniums, just like the ones Eleanor had always planted back in Oak Ridge. They parked across the street from the Whitaker house. It was a beautiful Victorian home with a wide porch and gingerbread trim, well maintained but with an air of solitude about it. Flower boxes hung from the windows filled with blooming geraniums. A porch swing moved slightly in the gentle spring breeze. It looked like a house from another era, despite its fresh paint and modern touches. Margaret sat in the car, staring at the house, unable to make herself move. Cooper waited patiently, understanding the enormity of the moment. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Cooper asked. "We could watch the house, try to see her from a distance first. Or I could approach her alone, feel out the situation." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, I've waited 80 years for answers. I'm not waiting another minute." They approached the front door, and Margaret raised her hand to knock. Her arm felt impossibly heavy, as if all the years of waiting had condensed into this single moment, weighing her down. Before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door opened, and there she was. A young woman stood in the doorway wearing a simple blue dress with a white cardigan. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves that brushed her shoulders. Her face was exactly as it appeared in the photographs from 1937. The high cheekbones, the slightly pointed chin, the small birthmark near her left eyebrow. Her eyes, A warm hazel, widened in recognition, and something else. Was it fear? Relief? It was impossible to tell. "I've been expecting you," the woman said softly. Her voice was gentle, with the slight Connecticut accent that had all but disappeared from the region in the intervening decades. The accent Margaret herself had lost during her college years. "Mother?" Margaret whispered, the word catching in her throat. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Hello, Margaret." For a long moment, neither woman moved. They stood frozen in time, separated by decades of absence, yet connected by blood and memory. Then, with a small sob, Margaret stepped forward. The younger woman opened her arms, and they embraced. The daughter, now physically decades older than her mother, Elizabeth Crane, or Eleanor Matthews, invited them into her home. The interior was an unusual blend of modern conveniences and items that looked as if they belonged in a museum. An old Philco radio sat next to a modern television. Hand-embroidered doilies adorned the arms of a contemporary sofa. Books from the 1930s shared shelf space with recent bestsellers. It was the home of someone straddling two different eras. "You must have so many questions," the woman said, her hands folded neatly in her lap, just as they were in photographs from 1937. She sat across from Margaret in the living room, Cooper positioned slightly apart, giving them space while maintaining his professional presence. "Are you my mother?" Margaret asked directly, her voice steadier now. "Are you Eleanor Matthews?" "Yes," she said simply. "I am." The silence that followed was profound. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, aware that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Margaret simply stared at the woman before her, trying to reconcile the impossible. "How?" she finally managed to ask. "How is this possible?" What followed was a story so extraordinary that it defied belief, and yet the evidence was sitting right there before them, unchanged by time, a living impossibility. "That morning in 1937, she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times in private, rehearsed but never shared. "Started like any other. I prepared breakfast for you and James. I made your favorite, oatmeal with cinnamon and raisins. James had coffee and toast. I washed the dishes. I made your lunch, a ham sandwich, an apple, and 2 of those molasses cookies you loved so much. And then I went to get the mail." She paused, her fingers working at an invisible thread on her skirt, a nervous habit Margaret remembered from her childhood. There was a letter, addressed to me, no return address. The postmark was from Boston. Inside was a single piece of paper with an address in Boston and instructions to come alone, immediately, if I wanted to protect my family. The letter claimed that James was in danger, that he had unwittingly become involved with dangerous people through his work at the bank. It said that men were coming to our house that very day, and that only I could stop them, by meeting with someone who could explain everything. It said if I told James or called the police, it would only make things worse. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? But the letter warned against that. Wake James. But what if that put him in more danger? I made a split-second decision. I would go to Boston, learn what this was about, and be back before dinner. It never occurred to me that I might not come home that night, that I might not come home for 80 years. I left without taking anything but my purse and the clothes I was wearing. I didn't even leave a note because I thought I'd be back in a few hours. I walked to the bus station and took the first bus to Boston. The whole way there, I was sick with worry. What had James gotten involved in? How could I protect you both? What would I find in Boston? When I arrived at the address, it was a nondescript office building in the financial district. I was directed to a room on the 3rd floor, where a man in a gray suit was waiting for me. He sat behind a large desk in a sparsely furnished office. There was nothing personal in the room. No photographs, no certificates on the walls. Just a desk, some chairs, and filing cabinets. He told me his name was Dr. Richards, and that he represented a government research program. What he told me next was so outlandish that I nearly walked out. But something in his manner, in the details he knew about James and you, kept me listening. He explained that they had been monitoring certain individuals with unique genetic markers, individuals who might possess unusual longevity or immunity to disease. Apparently, my maternal grandmother had been part of their study decades earlier, and they believed I had inherited her genetic makeup. My grandmother lived to be 103, in an era when most women didn't see 60. She never had a day of illness in her life. She was still gardening and preserving her own food well into her 90s. Dr. Richards said they needed my help, that by studying me they could potentially develop treatments for numerous diseases. I told him I needed to return home to my family, That's when he revealed the truth. There was no threat to James. The letter had been a ruse to get me to come without alerting anyone. I was furious. I stood to leave, but then he showed me something that made me freeze. Surveillance photographs of you playing in our yard, of James at work. We've been watching your family for years, he said. We can make things very difficult for them if you don't cooperate. It was 1937. The country was still in the grip of the Depression. Jobs were scarce. Dr. Richards implied that James could lose his position at the bank, that we could lose our home, that you might even be taken away from us. He mentioned connections with child welfare authorities, how easy it would be to have you removed from our care. I agreed to stay for 2 days, to undergo some tests, just long enough to satisfy them, I thought. Then I would return home and we would move away, start fresh somewhere else, maybe California, where James's brother lived, somewhere beyond their reach. But 2 days turned into a week. They kept finding reasons to delay my departure. More tests, more questions. They moved me to a facility outside the city. They took my purse with the little money I had. I realized I was no longer a volunteer. I was a prisoner. I tried to escape twice. The first time, they caught me before I made it off the grounds. The second time, I almost reached a main road when they found me. After that, they kept me sedated most of the time. They told me that if I cooperated, they would eventually let me go home. If I continued to resist, they would make good on their threats against you and James. Weeks passed, then months. I lost track of time. They injected me with various compounds, took endless samples of blood and tissue. They subjected me to tests I didn't understand. All I knew was that I wasn't aging the way I should. A year would pass, and my face in the mirror remained unchanged. I later learned that what they thought was a genetic predisposition to longevity was actually something far more unusual. Their treatments designed to isolate and enhance this trait had an effect they never anticipated. They didn't just slow my aging, they stopped it completely. By 1945, when the war ended, I hadn't aged a day since 1937. The doctors were astonished. They kept promising that once they understood what was happening, they would let me go. But I knew better by then. I was no longer a person to them. I was a specimen, a scientific curiosity, a potential goldmine of medical breakthroughs. I asked about you and James constantly. At first, they would tell me nothing. Then, as years passed, they would give me small bits of information. They told me when you started school, when James was promoted at the bank. They used these updates as rewards for my cooperation and withheld them when I was difficult. In 1949, they showed me a newspaper article about James being honored for his service to the community. There was a photograph of him with you, age 16 by then. You looked so much like me that it broke my heart. I didn't recognize James at first. He had aged so much, his hair gray, his face lined. That's when I truly understood what had been taken from me. Margaret interrupted, her voice choked with emotion. But surely someone looked for you? The police? My father? Dr. Richards told me they had covered their tracks thoroughly. A private investigator hired by your father was led to believe I had run off with another man to California. False evidence was planted. Witnesses were paid to provide sightings of me in various cities across the country. They even had a woman who resembled me cash checks in San Francisco to create a paper trail. The facility where they kept me was officially a sanitarium for tuberculosis patients. No one questioned the security or the isolation. Over time, as the original research team aged and retired, I became something of a legacy project, handed down from one scientist to the next. In the 1960s, the program was officially shut down as part of budget cuts. Most of the subjects, there were others like me, though none with my particular reaction to the treatments, were quietly released with sworn statements of secrecy and modest compensation. But I was different. My condition was deemed too unusual, too potentially valuable. I was transferred to a private research foundation, funded by pharmaceutical companies interested in anti-aging treatments. By then, I had been officially declared dead. A death certificate had been issued in 1952, listing my cause of death as tuberculosis. Even if I had managed to escape, who would believe me? A woman who claimed to be Eleanor Matthews, who should have been in her 40s but still looked 24. The decades passed. I was moved from facility to facility. Sometimes the conditions were better, sometimes worse. I was allowed more freedoms as time went on. Books, television, occasional supervised outings. I learned about the changing world through these limited windows. I saw men walk on the moon on a small black and white television. I read about the Vietnam War in magazines. I watched the Berlin Wall fall on CNN. It wasn't until 5 years ago that I finally managed to escape. One of the younger researchers, a woman named Dr. Eliza Chen, helped me. She disagreed with the ethics of keeping me captive and falsified records to show that I had died of complications. She provided me with a new identity, Elizabeth Crane, and enough money to start over. Dr. Chen was the first person in decades who saw me as a human being rather than a test subject. She risked her career, possibly even her freedom, to help me. She created documentation for me, a birth certificate, a social security number, a driver's license. She taught me about the modern world, how to use computers and smartphones, how to navigate public transportation, how credit cards worked, and then she helped me disappear. But I had no idea how to find you, or if you were even still alive. The world had changed so much. Everything I knew was gone. Everyone I loved had lived entire lives without me. I've spent the last 5 years learning to exist in this new century, always looking for some trace of you or your father. 6 months ago, I finally worked up the courage to visit our old town, only to learn that James had passed away decades ago. I visited his grave. I stood there for hours, talking to him, apologizing for not coming home that day. A groundskeeper told me you had moved away years ago, but no one knew where. I was in Grand Central that day, returning from Oak Ridge. I had no idea my photograph was being taken. No idea that it would somehow find its way to you. She fell silent, her story complete. Margaret sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. Cooper had taken out a small notebook during the narrative, but had stopped writing halfway through, too engrossed in the impossible tale. "Do you believe me?" Eleanor asked quietly, her young face betraying the uncertainty of someone who has been disbelieved for decades. Margaret studied the face before her, the face from her photographs, from her fading childhood memories, from her dreams. It was impossible. It defied everything she knew about reality. And yet, here she was. "I believe you," she said. "Mrs. Wilson," Cooper interjected, his professional skepticism reasserting itself. "I need to caution you. This story is extraordinary. Without evidence." "I have evidence," Eleanor said. She left the room briefly and returned with a small wooden box, weathered and worn at the edges, the brass clasp tarnished with age. Inside was a collection of items: her original wedding ring, photographs she had managed to keep hidden during her captivity, letters she had written to James and Margaret but never been allowed to send, medical documents she had stolen during her escape. There was a lock of hair, James's, that she had saved from before their marriage. There was a small handkerchief with the initials EM embroidered in the corner, yellowed with age. "I couldn't leave all of it behind," she explained, her fingers gently touching each item, as if to confirm its reality. "These were my anchors to reality when they tried to make me forget who I was. Each time they moved me, I smuggled these things with me. They're all I have left of my real life." "I remember this," Margaret whispered, picking up a small silver locket. It was oval-shaped, with a delicate floral pattern engraved on its surface. "You wore it every day." "It has your baby hair in it," Eleanor said. "I kept it close to my heart for all those years." Margaret opened the locket with trembling fingers, seeing the tiny lock of blonde hair inside, her own hair cut when she was barely a year old, preserved for nearly 9 decades. Over the next few hours, Margaret and Eleanor talked. They cried, they shared stories, they filled in the vast emptiness of all the years they had lost. Margaret told Eleanor about her childhood, about growing up with James, about college and marriage and motherhood. Eleanor told Margaret about the decades of captivity, about the scientists who had studied her, about her adjustment to the modern world after her escape. Cooper tactfully excused himself, saying he would return the next day. This reunion was too private, too profound for an outsider to witness. "What happens now?" Margaret asked eventually, as the afternoon light began to fade outside the windows of the Victorian house. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, looking down at her eternally young hands. "I've lived in fear for so long. Fear of being found. Fear of not being found. Now that you're here, I don't know what comes next." "We have time to figure it out," Margaret said. Then, with a sad smile, "One of us has plenty of time, it seems." The impossibility of their situation wasn't lost on either of them. A mother who looked younger than her daughter, a daughter who had lived an entire lifetime while her mother remained frozen in time. The normal order of things had been inverted, reality turned inside out. "Did you ever regret it?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Going to Boston that day?" "Every minute of every day," Eleanor whispered. her young face contorted with decades of pain. "I missed your entire childhood. I missed seeing you grow up, go to school, fall in love, have children of your own. I missed a lifetime with James. There's no scientific miracle that can give that back to me." As the evening wore on, they moved to the kitchen. Eleanor made tea the old-fashioned way, heating water in a kettle on the stove rather than using a microwave. Some habits never changed. They sat at the kitchen table, the modern electric lights casting a warm glow over them. Two women separated by time, yet united by blood. "Your father," Eleanor said hesitantly, stirring her tea. Was he happy in his life after I disappeared?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "He never stopped loving you," she answered honestly. "He never stopped hoping you'd come back. But he found purpose in raising me, in his work. He had friends. He laughed. He lived. He wasn't a broken man, if that's what you're asking. But there was always a part of him that was waiting. Always a lamp left burning in the window. That's good. That's what I wanted for him. For both of you." "Tomorrow," Margaret said, setting down her teacup, "I'd like you to meet my family, my children, my grandchildren. They've grown up hearing stories about you. What will you tell them? About this?" She gestured to her youthful appearance. "The truth, or as much of it as they need to know. That you were taken from us, but now you're back. The rest, we'll figure it out together." "I missed 80 years of your life," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to take Margaret's wrinkled hand in her smooth one. "I don't want to miss another day." The following morning, Cooper returned as promised. He was accompanied by a lawyer friend who specialized in unusual cases, people who needed new identities or who had been declared legally dead but were very much alive. The lawyer, a serious woman named Janet Hoffman, listened to Eleanor's story without visible skepticism, taking detailed notes. "What the government did to you was criminal," the lawyer stated when Eleanor had finished. "There could be grounds for a massive lawsuit, wrongful imprisonment, human rights violations, medical ethics breaches. The statute of limitations might be an issue, but given the exceptional circumstances." "Most of the people responsible are long dead," Eleanor said, shaking her head, "and I have no desire to become a public spectacle or a laboratory specimen again. All I want is a chance to know my daughter and her family." "We can help establish your identity legally without drawing attention," Janet explained. "There are ways to create the necessary paper trail. It's complicated, but not impossible. The greater challenge might be explaining." Cooper hesitated, searching for the right words. "Your condition. I've had decades to think about that," Eleanor said with a sad smile. "I'll be Eleanor Matthews to my family. To the rest of the world, I can continue to be Elizabeth Crane, Margaret's distant cousin who bears a striking resemblance to her long-lost mother. It's not perfect, but it allows us to have a relationship without inviting unwanted attention." That afternoon, Margaret's children and grandchildren began to arrive at Eleanor's house. They had been told only that Margaret had made an astounding discovery related to her mother's disappearance. One by one, they pulled up in front of the Victorian home, curious and slightly concerned about their mother's and grandmother's cryptic invitation. One by one, they were introduced to Eleanor. Their reactions ranged from shock to disbelief to tearful acceptance. Margaret's oldest son, James, named for his grandfather, studied Eleanor's face with particular intensity. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "You have her eyes," Eleanor said softly to him. "My father's eyes. Dad always said I looked like your side of the family," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret's youngest son, Michael, was the most immediately accepting. "Life is full of mysteries," he said, embracing Eleanor without hesitation. "Who am I to say what's possible and what isn't?" Her daughter, Catherine, always the most practical of the three, had the most questions. She wanted to understand the science, the legal implications, the long-term plan, but even she, by the end of the afternoon, had accepted the impossible truth standing before her. As the day progressed, the initial awkwardness gave way to a tentative warmth. Margaret's grandchildren, less burdened by the impossibility of the situation, asked Eleanor questions about life in the 1930s, what movies she had seen, what music she had listened to, what it was like to live during the Depression. Her great-grandchildren showed her how to use a smartphone, delighting in her amazement at technology they took for granted. By evening, a fragile new normal had begun to emerge. Plans were made for regular visits. Holidays would be spent together. Eleanor would begin the process of legally reclaiming her identity, or at least creating a viable new one that allowed her to exist in the modern world. After everyone had left, Margaret stayed behind. At 87, she was physically frail but mentally sharp. The emotional toll of the day had exhausted her, and Eleanor insisted she spend the night rather than drive back to the city. "It's strange," Margaret said as Eleanor set the tea on the bedside table in the guest room. "All my life I've been the one taking care of others, being a mother, and now here you are, looking young enough to be my granddaughter, bringing me tea in bed." "I may look young," Eleanor said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "but I've lived those 80 years too, in my own way. They weren't the same years you lived, but they've left their mark on me. What will you do now, with all the time you have?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "For so long, my only goal was survival. Then it was finding you, now that I have—" She trailed off, then smiled. "Maybe I'll go to college. I always wanted to be a teacher." "I became a teacher," Margaret said. "English literature. Like mother, like daughter. I missed so much," Eleanor said finally, her voice breaking. "Your first day of school, your graduation, your wedding, the birth of your children. But you're here now," Margaret said, reaching for Eleanor's hand. "You'll be here for things I won't see. My great-grandchildren growing up. Their children, perhaps. You can tell them about me, about James. Our family story won't be lost. I promise," Eleanor whispered. The next day, Margaret returned to her home in the city. There were arrangements to be made, explanations to be crafted for friends and neighbors, a new reality to be navigated. Margaret had decided to tell most people a simplified version of the truth, that they had discovered her mother hadn't died, but had been living under another identity due to complicated circumstances she wasn't at liberty to discuss. "I'll call you tonight," Margaret said as they embraced on the porch, "and I'll be back next weekend." "I'll be here," Eleanor replied. "I'll always be here now." As Margaret's car disappeared down the street, Eleanor stood on the porch of her Victorian home, the morning sun warm on her forever young face. For the first time in 80 years, she felt the weight of her impossible existence lift slightly. The world had moved on without her. Everyone she had known was gone or transformed by time. She remained a woman out of place, a living anachronism, but she was no longer alone. In a small town in upstate New York, in a beautiful old house on Elm Street, Eleanor Matthews, a young mother who vanished in 1937, began her second chance at life.